Well, let me begin by thanking all the organizers, the president, the dean, Dr. Amir, and Mahmoud, who have all been very helpful to sponsoring this visit. The first time I've been in Egypt. And I'm really honored to be here with you to discuss this issue. Can we go back to the beginning? Okay, and I'm going to take control of. Okay, so I want to just spend a few minutes. I'm going to be talking about how it is that this idea of industrial policy has emerged quite recently from the shadows. It was banished for 40 years at least by the neoliberal paradigm, which said no industrial policy. But it's emerged now quite recently. That's what I want to talk about. But I want to follow on from what the Dean was saying, because it would be crazy to just talk about the emergence of industrial policy as though it's just an academic topic. Because, as the Dean said, we are living in a completely crazy world. And so I want to spend just a few minutes before I come on to my main subject, just outlining some of the craziness that we're in, and in particular, the fact that we are living in a Trump presidency which is changing the very nature of the US presidency. With the help, and this is a really important point, not enough emphasized, with the help of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court plus the Trump presidency have combined to create a concentration of power at the very top of the executive branch, completely marginalizing the Congress, to the point where the presidency is able to override long-established laws domestically and internationally. Trump and his team are expressing contempt for long-established allies of the United States, such as, for example, Europe. Trump says that the European Union was constructed in order to undermine the United States. So he has converted the idea of friends into the idea of frenemies. This is a new word, frenemies. It means a combination of friend and enemy. The European Union is both a friend and an enemy of the United States. So this is the world that we're living in, and I'll just underline this point by showing you a couple of recent, let's see, does this work? Whoops. No, this laser seems not to be working, but just look at the top one. So this is David Young, who's a leading figure in the American business community, who says, we are living in a time where certainty and predictability do not exist. Very striking. And secondly, Adrian Gray, we are witnessing a basic redrawing of the rules of global trade. And as though this was not enough, let me give you this evidence from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which since 1947 has constructed what they call the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock at midnight signals a global catastrophe. And the doomsday clock was set the furthest away from midnight in 1991. And that was because that was because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and related events in 1991. But now, in January of this year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has set the doomsday clock at 89 seconds to midnight, and that's the closest it has been since 1947. The closest to a global catastrophe, according to these people. And these people are not just rating nuclear catastrophe, they're rating a whole range of really major global threats. So this is one indicator of the kind of world that we are living in. And so let's go back to the 1990s, which was the decade in which this doomsday clock was set at the furthest away from global catastrophe. And just think of the circumstances of the 1990s, because this was the decade in which the neoliberal paradigm became completely dominant in Western thinking about not just Western economies, but about how developing countries should develop. That is, about the appropriate role of government in developing countries. This really crystallized out in the 1990s. And the idea was that transnational corporations, mainly Western transnational corporations and mainly US transnational corporations, were establishing global networks to link up Western finance, on the one hand, with cheap labor in developing countries to produce goods and services mainly for Western consumers. And the idea was that this linkage of Western finance with cheap labor in developing countries would produce win-win benefits to everybody. That is, this linkage would produce big profits for the transnational corporations, number one. Number two, rising wages, rising urbanization in developing countries. And number three, opportunities for developing countries to rise up the product complexity ladder, so that instead of, by developing countries integrating into global supply chains, a country like Vietnam, for example, would be able to get into the automobile industry not by producing whole cars and selling them on the global market as Vietnamese cars, but just producing certain parts of cars. But this would be a step on the way to producing more and more complex products in developing countries, and therefore rising wages in developing countries. This was the idea. And people, especially in the West, celebrated this whole international liberal economic order, as it was called, the liberal international economic order. They celebrated it with phrases like a world without borders, without economic borders. That was a good thing. The earth is flat, meaning that the developing countries were rising up the income hierarchy to become closer and closer to the average income levels in the Western countries. And this was, of course, also celebrated as the end of history, meaning that all the world was converging towards liberal democratic political systems. You look back on this and you think, how could people possibly think what they were saying? But they were saying this. So that was the idea of out of this thinking emerged the neoliberal paradigm of the appropriate role of the state into complete dominance of the Western development agenda. And so many economists, including Richard Baldwin, celebrated this, who said that these developments I've just been talking about constitute perhaps the most momentous global economic change in the last 100 years. This was the idea. Inclusive globalization was bringing everybody in the whole world up in terms of prosperity, in terms of liberty. And so this was something really to be celebrated. And the World Bank and the IMF, organizations that I particularly studied myself, really took this these ideas, this paradigm on board to guide developing countries. And so I just want to run over some of the key ideas. These ideas were never questioned. They were just taken as premises. So they were guiding the thinking, but they were not questioned. They were really beyond question. One idea was that the capitalist economy has an inbuilt tendency to stability, to equilibrium. That is, crises are just exceptional. They're not part of the normal process of a capitalist economy. A second idea, this is really important, government should not intervene on the supply or the production side of economies, except sometimes, occasionally, to fix what were called market failures. But other than that, the composition of production, so how much comes from agriculture and which agricultural crops, how much comes from industry and which industrial products, and so on, all this should just be determined by competitive processes of businesses seeking to maximize their own profits. And out of this process of competition will come the most efficient allocation of resources, and that will be what propels the growth of the economy. And the third key idea, governments must hold business at arm's length. This is really important, especially in terms of what's happened with industrial policy. I'll come back to that. But this neoliberal idea, government must hold businesses at arm's length. Why? Because government intervention, meaning government interaction with businesses, as in business government councils and so on, very likely leads to inefficiency of resource allocation, number one, and number two, to business capture of economic policy, so that economic policy comes to serve the interests of particular businesses, like protection for particular businesses, which does not serve the larger societal interest. And the last key idea, completely implicit, not explicit, the last key idea is that these ideas are universal. That is to say, they apply to developed countries, they apply to developing countries. And so they apply to the US, they apply to Britain, they apply to South Korea, they apply to Egypt, they apply to everybody. I'm exaggerating somewhat, but I tell you I'm exaggerating only somewhat. I worked in the World Bank, as I'll come back to, and I've studied the IMF, and these ideas were really taken to be applicable to all developing countries. And so this paradigm gave rise to what we call the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus says that, as I've just said, the government should limit its role to providing what were called fundamentals. That was the word that was used, fundamentals, like peace, the rule of law, basic health and education. The government had to raise taxes in order to finance these basic services. And the key point is that all the things that the government does should be horizontal. That is, they should not be sector-specific. They should not favor some sectors ahead of others. They're horizontal. And that the distinction is between horizontal measures and vertical measures. Vertical meaning sector selective. That means measures that affect some sectors more than others, especially measures that encourage some sectors ahead of other sectors. And so, as I've just emphasized, the implication of all this is that the economies, the production composition of an economy, the Egyptian economy, for example, should be just left to the market, to business people, seeking to maximize profits. The government should not have a steering role which aims to encourage industries important for the economy's future growth. That should not be part of the government agenda. And so the red line in all this was that the government should not do industrial policy. Industrial policy became a toxic phrase, a phrase almost not allowed to be mentioned. And so to the extent that industrial policy was mentioned at all, it was mentioned in the context of the question, should the government of Egypt do industrial policy? And the answer was always no, for the reasons that I gave, because of inefficient resource allocation and because of business capture of government revenues. So the question that was not asked was how should a government, the Egyptian government, do industrial policy well rather than badly? What would be entailed in the Egyptian government doing an industrial policy to change the composition of production in a way good for Egypt's future economic growth? That question was simply not allowed to be asked. In other words, industrial policy, the very phrase, was not in good currency. And the irony is that meanwhile, the US and some other Western economies, such as France, they were doing industrial policy, but they were never advertising it. So it was disguised industrial policy, and they were telling the rest of the world, don't do industrial policy. So let me come back to my experience in the World Bank. I worked in the World Bank in the 1980s and the 1990s, and by that time I had already lived in South Korea. I'd already lived in Taiwan. I was busy while I was working in the World Bank on quite other matters. At the weekends and in the evenings, I was writing what became this book called Governing the Market. And this book is all about Taiwan's, but also South Korea's and Japan's industrial policies. So I was writing this book as I was working in the World Bank on other matters. But I was really amazed. My colleagues in the World Bank, the people I was meeting every day with, they would not allow any conversation about industrial policy or about import substituting industrialization. I wanted to talk to them about this because I saw how different was what I was seeing in East Asia from what the World Bank was telling developing countries about how to do development. But they weren't interested. They were actually frightened of even talking about industrial policy. And as recently as 2019, I went to the World Bank, I was visiting, and I just happened to hear that there was a small group of sort of heterodox economists within the World Bank, like 6 or 8 of them, who were meeting from time to discuss industrial policy. And so I was very interested, and I went to one of their meetings, and I was struck. They never used the word industrial policy. They were using the phrase cooperative partnerships program. Now, they were talking about industrial policy, but they didn't want to use those words because they were toxic words, even in 2019. And so that gives you some sense of the atmosphere, the dominance of the neoliberal way of thinking. And I have to make something clear at this point. There is a real terminological problem because the phrase, when we talk about industrial policy, it does not just mean industry, policy for industry. It means sector selective policy, but it might refer to agriculture, it might refer to services, it might refer to industry too. But we're kind of stuck with this phrase, but we should be using phrases like sector selective policy, SSP, or technology and productivity policy, or directional thrust policy. And that's actually the phrase I like best, directional thrust, because what it means is the state sets a direction for the economy's future growth and encourages more resources to go and boost that direction of growth into the future. But we are stuck with this phrase in industrial policy. So the next question then is, given that this has been the recipe for development, for the role of the state, how much progress have developing country regions made in terms of catching up? We've been in this era of apparently inclusive globalization for decades. So how much progress has there been in terms of developing countries improving their position, their relative position, vis-a-vis Western countries, for example, vis-a-vis the United States? The answer is that there is a glass ceiling. That is to say, very few developing countries have seriously raised their average income as a percentage of that of the West or of the United States. Very few. And those countries, apart from some very small ones, like islands and some oil exporters, apart from them, those countries are in Northeast Asia, and to some extent, Southeast Asia as well. So I'm going to show you a chart now, and this chart should shock you if you're paying at all attention, and it should be the background to everything we talk about, this chart. And the chart, I'll just describe it before I show it to you. On the vertical axis, it shows the percentage income, average income of regions of the world as a percentage of that of the US across time from 1990 through till more or less today. That's the vertical axis. And then on the horizontal axis, it's time from 1990 to today. And so if there is catch-up, if some developing regions are catching up, you see the lines going up from the bottom left up to the top right. And if the lines are just flat, then there's no catch-up. So this is the chart. Okay, so let me explain this chart. 1990 to 2000, to 2023, and then the percentage of each region's average income as a percentage of the US. So begin at the bottom. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the two bottom lines, you can see two things. One, the lines are flat. That is, there's no catch-up. And two, the lines are incredibly low. That is, the average income as a percentage of the US of South Asia, which has, 18% of the world's population, and Sub-Saharan Africa, are way below 10%, way below 10%. And then going up, we have the Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and we have the average of the whole of the low and middle income countries. And then we have this line, which is Latin America. So all these lines, accounting for a very large proportion of the world's population, are more or less flat, and they are all at 20% or less the US level. So this is really shocking, given what has been said about the benefits of inclusive globalization, the leveling up for the world. This simply has not happened. Where it has happened is on a modest scale. It's in the region called East Asia and the Pacific. And secondly, it's happened in China. So this is the China line from very, very low in 1990 through till about 20%, roughly 20%. This is at market exchange rates in 2023. So there's been quite a catch-up in China. The line is going up, but it's still very low, and that's something which is often ignored about China. It remains way down in the ranking of countries by average income. It remains somewhere around number 70 or so. So China has caught up to some substantial extent, but it has a lot of catching up still to do. You cannot understand President Xi and what he says and the whole Chinese policy without realizing that China expects to regain its status right at the top of the world order of prosperity as it had before the 19th century. China expects to regain it. And that is very much motivating China's engagement with the whole world. So the top line is South Korea. Now, if Taiwan was included, Taiwan would be even higher than Korea. But notice also that Korea is still only 50%. So it's not exactly, by this particular measure, which has all kinds of problems, but Korea has not exactly caught up with the United States, but it has certainly improved the level of prosperity very substantially, there's no question. And therefore the question is, how have they done it? Taiwan and Korea, also Japan and Singapore, how have they done it? What was the role of the state? But one effect of what I've just been showing you, that is the lack of catch-up, especially from sub-Saharan Africa and from West Asia, produces this, which is the most toxic issue in British politics, the most toxic issue. And this is one expression of that toxic issue. The Reform Party in Britain is ahead of all the other parties on the basis of this one issue. The Reform Party promises we will stop the boats. They have no scheme for stopping the boats. They just say we will stop the boats. And that is what mobilizes a substantial proportion of the British population to say, yes, we support reform. It's a really frightening prospect. It's a prospect of Britain going in the direction of Donald Trump. Oh yeah, and just to underline the point about China, you can see here that China has substantially improved from an extremely low, like sub-Saharan African level in 1990 through till about 25% of the US level today. I was actually quite shocked by the European Union figures, the percentage of European average income relative to that of the US. In market exchange rates, the average income of the European Union is only 51% of the US in purchasing power parity. It's about 75%. So Europe does lag quite a long way behind the United States by this particular measure. Okay, so what I've said should make clear already that there is a big problem with the neoliberal paradigm. It's not only that most of the developing world has not caught up as was promised by the Washington Consensus, but the one part of the world that has substantially caught up has not been using neoliberal principles. Oh yeah, this works. Okay. Thank you. Has not been using neoliberal principles. As I explain in this book, but many other scholars have done the same, using case studies. Chalmers Johnson, for example, with his famous book called Miti and the Japanese Miracle. And of course, China more recently. This can say that China was following the neoliberal recipe. So the question then is, how did all this great mass of economists all around the world, but especially in Western countries, especially in the World Bank, including and especially in the IMF, how did they respond to all this evidence from Northeast Asia? They responded by saying, okay, so we accept that these governments used industrial policy, number one. Number two, it was not effective. That is, they said that these countries which had the best performance in world history, the best catch-up performance in world history, they said these countries would have done even better if they had not done industrial policy, if they had not wasted all these resources in prioritizing the steel sector or the petrochemical sector or these others, or chips, advanced chips. They would have done even better if they had just left the production composition to the free play of market forces, of businesses seeking profits. This was just an out-of-the-blue affirmation of the neoliberal paradigm. They didn't produce any evidence. They couldn't produce any evidence that these economies would have done even better. But this was a way of dismissing the relevance of books like mine. And all the others. So And let me just, in case you think I'm making this up, let me just show you this book. This book is called The East Asia Miracle, and this was a book written by the World Bank, published in 1993. And in this book, the Japanese forced the World Bank, against its wishes, forced the World Bank to do a study of development in the whole East Asia region. And so the bottom line conclusion, I'm going to read it out in case you think I'm making this up or I'm exaggerating. The bottom line conclusion is this: our assessment of intervention is that promotion of specific industries did not work and therefore holds little promise for other developing countries. I just want to read that again. This is the World Bank's finding after doing all this research on East Asia. Our assessment of intervention is that promotion of specific industries did not work and therefore holds little promise for other developing countries. So this was a ringing endorsement of the neoliberal paradigm for developing countries. So that was the situation. And I want to now turn to this question of how it is that this very idea of industrial policy, selective intervention to promote certain industries ahead of others, how has it returned to good currency, or how has it returned to fashion, so to speak? And just to illustrate this point, here's a quote from Andy Haldane in the Financial Times just a month or so ago. Andy Haldane was the chief economist of the Bank of England, and in his Financial Times column, he says, industrial strategies are now all the rage around the world. That's the first point. The second point is that the reasons for this change, that they're all the rage, has to do with the combination of, on the one hand, slow growth in Western countries, and secondly, the apparent success, this is very striking, the apparent success of such strategies, industrial policies, in stimulating growth in much of Asia, from South Korea to Singapore. So that's one illustration of the recent return to favor of industrial policy. And here's an even more striking example. So this is from the recent IMF World Economic Outlook, published just a couple of months ago. And it has a chapter, a whole chapter, called Industrial Policy. And I was amazed just to see this chapter. I bet this is the very first time in its whole history the IMF has ever published a paper or a chapter called Industrial Policy, because previously it was a toxic subject. It was kept right out. And so the opening sentence of this chapter is, industrial policy has returned to the center of policy debate. That's a really striking statement. And of course, then the next question is, what does the IMF say about the possibilities for industrial policy? And I'll come back to that later. So the question then is, why has industrial policy returned to favor, to the center of policy debate? And the short answer is one word, which is China. China's capitalism, state-led capitalism, which is clearly using as a central instrument industrial policy, is out-competing large parts of Western business and causing great disruption in Western countries, such as the United States. And that disruption, in turn, has paved the way for Donald Trump, with very unhappy voters having been disrupted by very large inflows of cheap and good quality Chinese imports. And it's now understood, finally it's understood, that China has used industrial policy for more than 2 decades to accelerate its own self-reliance, that is to accelerate import substitution so that it is less dependent on especially the United States. It's less dependent on the United States. And secondly, so import substitution is the first step. Second step is to overbuild factory capacity so that factories in China are investing on a scale that cannot possibly be absorbed domestically. They must export. And they're using the export markets, like in the United States, to gain economies of scale, to lower their price, to increase their quality through the export markets. And the third point in Chinese industrial policy, they're aiming, and they have already built what they call choke points. That is, choke points to dominate certain sectors which are vital for the US, vital for the West. And the most obvious and conspicuously successful example is rare earth minerals and rare earth magnets. And as you know, China right now is threatening the whole world, but especially the United States, by limiting the export of rare earth minerals and rare earth magnets that are essential across the whole of the industrial frontier. And so just, a couple of weeks ago, the Central Committee gathering in China, the Central Committee published a document which ordered the government and the business to work faster to boost China's strength in manufacturing and product quality, aerospace, transportation, and cyberspace, and to boost technological self-reliance. So, to put this statement in context, China is now having a crash, an economic recession, a bad economic recession, because of the crash of the property market, similar to the United States in 2008, but a bad crash. And the response of the government, the Chinese government, is not to boost social security, to boost healthcare, in order to stimulate consumption within China, increase domestic demand within China. No, the response of the Chinese government is to redouble the export push, the reliance on other countries for demand for Chinese-produced factories. So that's where, even though, and this is a really extraordinary figure, even though China already produces 1/3 of the world's total manufactured production. In other words, it produces more manufactured production than the US, Japan, Germany, South Korea, and the UK. All combined, China produces more. And yet, the Central Committee decided that China should produce even more of the world's manufacturing goods, which will cause a great deal of disruption, including, I imagine, in Egypt and in the Middle East. But this is the situation that we're living in. And just to give you one example of the scale of this is the Huawei conglomerate. It's recently opened a research center in Shanghai with 35,000 employees. 35,000 employees. Just imagine that. And it's occupying 10 times the space and offices that Google has in its headquarters in California. 10 times the space. That's the scale of the kind of investments that are being made in China now. And I'm going to skip this. So, China has really precipitated a rethinking of the whole idea of industrial policy. And this is brought out by this statement by President Biden in 2021. China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch. And it was this kind of thinking that finally overcame the US commitment to neoliberalism and its decision that it just had to embrace a more strategic kind of industrial policy. And the really striking thing is that this switch towards industrial policy was led not by economists in the Biden administration. It was led by Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor. So it was driven by national security considerations. And that was what then led into things like the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act also of 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act, that is camouflage. It was not about reducing inflation. The Inflation Reduction Act is an industrial policy act, out and out, which gave large subsidies for firms in certain sectors of the United States, and which also called for the US to restrict exports to China in key commodities, such as advanced chips. So the US industrial policy is not just about boosting certain industries ahead of others, it's also about restricting the growth, the competition from China. Both parts of the US policy constitute US industrial policy. And of course, this wildly violated WTO rules. The US has kicked the WTO out of the ballpark, so to speak. Doesn't pay any attention to the WTO. And the European Union has responded in somewhat similar way with its what is called European Green Deal industrial plan. Green Deal meaning is an attempt to get at legitimacy. And so this quote from Chris Miller, who wrote this famous book now called Chips Wars. Chris Miller had a piece in the Financial Times just a week or so ago in which he said, Beijing, Brussels, and Washington are all searching for the most efficient and asymmetrical ways to gum up their adversaries' supply chains. That is, to break, obstruct their adversaries' supply chains. So this is an indication of the kind of confrontational world, the kind of zero-sum world, the kind of win-lose globalization, as distinct from win-win globalization. We're in the win-lose type of globalization now. And so, but the bottom line of all this, these governments searching for the most efficient and asymmetrical ways to gum up their adversaries' supply chains, the bottom line is that they're thinking much more strategically than they were thinking before about the appropriate role of the government. And let me see, okay. And now we're into Trump 2, but Trump 2 is using tariffs mostly, and it's very, very incoherent. His whole approach, whether tariffs or other related things. And so I'm not going to delay on it. But the bottom line of all this, in the world that we're now living in, is that this combination of Trump's very sort of improvisational industrial policy using tariffs with no clear logic behind the tariffs, the combination of that plus China's excess production, boosting production into export markets and undermining domestic industries in those export markets, it's causing severe disruptions and damage in many other countries around the world. This is the combination that's driving a great deal of the disorder. And so one question is how the World Bank has responded to this. And as I mentioned, the World Bank has just recently issued, in March of this year, for the first time ever, just like the IMF has this chapter on industrial policy, so the World Bank has recently issued, for the first time ever, a conceptual note on industrial policy. And its bottom line is that policy choice for structural change, that is, change in the composition of production, should begin with the question, what is the failure that is being addressed by the industrial policy? If one is not addressing a market or government failure, the policy is not well motivated. So this is a way, a disguised way, in which the World Bank continues to insist that basically developing countries should not do industrial policy, because it's often very difficult to identify market failures. And they're saying, if you can't identify a clear market failure, then you shouldn't even think about an industrial policy. And even if you can identify a market failure, then maybe you still shouldn't try to intervene, because the costs of intervening would be greater than the costs of not intervening. So the bank is trying to minimize the scope for industrial policy, even though it tries to pretend that it's being positive about the potential of industrial policy. And so I'm going to, let's see, how much time do I have? Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. Let me just see. I'm going to make my slides available to any of you who want to see them, and I'm going to skip over a number of them which concerned general principles for how to do industrial policy well, as distinct from how to do it badly. So I talk about the political constraints on policy choice. I talk about state capacity constraints on policy choice, but I'm not going to run over this because I want to come to just two particular cases, namely how Taiwan did industrial policy and then how China is doing industrial policy. So let me just summarize some points about Taiwan to give you some sense of the scale that Taiwan, which is a small economy, like at this time in the 1980s, early 1990s, the economy had a population of around about 22 million or so, quite small. But just look at the scale of it. At the top, the Council of Economic Planning and Development, which had 12 councillors, of whom all but one were cabinet ministers. So this was very much the political body steering the whole process. And that council had a staff of about 300 people. That is economists, engineers, well, I should say engineers, and then some economists, because mostly they were engineers, not economists. Economists were sort of kept to the side. And then, so that's at the top. Then there was the Science and Technology Advisory Board. And this is really interesting. I don't know whether Egypt has anything similar, but it should. So this was chaired by the Minister of Science and Technology, who was number 3 in the cabinet. So there was the Prime Minister, there was the Governor of the Central Bank, number 2, that's very striking. Number 3 was the Minister of Science and Technology. And it had between 7 and 10 advisors. The number changed over the years. And the significant point is that all these people were foreigners. They were not Taiwanese. And they all had expertise in some branch of science and technology. Like, for example, the French Minister of Science and Technology was a member of this council. And the staff of the council, quite a large staff, were all Taiwanese. So there were foreigners on the council making the decisions, and the staff was Taiwanese. It met twice a year, once in Taiwan, once somewhere else. And that was the second entity. The third entity was the Hsinchu Science Park. And in 1983, this quite small economy had a science park with more than 10,000 employees divided into various separate organizations. One of these was ERSO, Electronics Research Service Organization, which had a staff of 700 people, mainly engineers, a few economists, and they were pioneering Taiwan's push into electronics. And this was the place, Hsinchu Science Park, that gave birth to many of Taiwan's best-known firms, such as the iconic TSMC, which is the world's monopoly producer of advanced chips. And President Trump is putting all kinds of pressure on the Taiwan government and on TSMC to move its production from Taiwan to the United States. And the TSMC and the government are very, very reluctant to do that. They are doing it, but they're very reluctant to do it, and they're not moving their most advanced chip production to the United States. They're keeping the most advanced in Taiwan. But the point is that this firm began in Hsinchu Science Park with a great deal of help, direct help from the government. And then at the bottom, I just want to spend a minute about this Industrial Development Bureau. So the Industrial Development Bureau had a staff of about 200, mostly engineers, and they were divided into various sector teams. And the sector teams were obliged to spend most of their working months outside of Taipei, outside of the capital, going up and down the country, visiting factories, visiting firms, and finding out what the problems were at each company, at the factory level, at the shop floor level, but also, secondly, bringing information to the firms about world market trends, about opportunities abroad for exporting. And I've been to many developing countries since I was in Taiwan and have asked people in these countries, do you have anybody, any organization similar to the Industrial Development Bureau? And the answer is almost always no. And yet it seems to me this is such an obvious thing to do. It's like an equivalent to an agricultural extension service. So everybody has agricultural extension services where people, the extension services go out and visit farms and find out about the problems on the farms, but also tell the farmers about new technologies, new plants, and so on. Well, this is what they're doing, but with reference to manufacturing firms. So, and it would not be difficult to organize in any kind of state, but for some reason or another, this idea has not caught on. And then finally, in this whole organization, all industries are required to have an industry association. And so the industry association has an elected committee, but power lies with the secretary. And the secretary of each industrial association is supplied by, appointed by the government. So this gives the government a link into every single industrial sector of the economy. So this is the way that Taiwan organized its industrial policy. A key point, not just in Taiwan, but also in South Korea, also in Japan, a key point that I don't have time to elaborate on is that finance in these Northeast Asian countries has been patient finance, meaning that in contrast to the Anglo financial model, which is all short-term, so if a firm in the Anglo model gets into difficulties, the bank pulls the financing and tips the firm into bankruptcy, and those resources get released to be used more profitably elsewhere. That's the idea of the short-term finance, which is at the basis of the Anglo model. That's not the case in East Asia. Finance in East Asia is obliged to be patient. So if a firm gets into difficulties, the lenders do not simply pull the financing and tip the firm into bankruptcy. They work with the firm to keep it going much longer than would be the case in the Anglo system. And that means that firms in East Asia can carry very high levels of debt relative to their equity, much higher levels of debt to equity than is possible in a more Anglo or more Latin American financial system. I won't elaborate that anymore because I want to come on to China and just run you through this set of characteristics that make the Chinese model so very, very effective. Think of a combination lock. So with a combination lock, you have to get a whole series of digits into alignment. And you can think of that as an analogy to what China has done, beginning with the 5-year plans, which are authorized right at the very top of the political hierarchy. Secondly, massive infrastructure investment in all kinds of infrastructure. Thirdly, what are called government guidance funds. So these are state-based venture capital vehicles which take, and this is the key word again, patient equity shares in high-tech sectors across the full innovation cycle from the very beginning right through to product production. These funds are available operating like venture capitalists, but operating on long-term time horizons, not short-term time horizons. The fourth element, large low-interest loans, so this is debt, from state-owned investment funds and development banks. The fifth element, as I've mentioned before, is factory overcapacity, so massive overcapacity relative to domestic demand, so that the factories must export. And then finally, the work ethic, which is known as the 996 work ethic. 996 refers to 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. And that has recently been upgraded, so to speak, to 007. 007. 007 means midnight to midnight, 7 days a week. That's an exaggeration of the new Chinese work ethics. In other words, there's intense pressure on people to put in long working hours. Okay, so I want to finish on this note, just to remind you, this is the background to everything we talk about. The fact that most of the world has not been catching up with the West in general, but the US in particular. And this is a point that seems to me not enough attention is being given to. The question is how to change this. And we have to give more attention to what happened in East Asia, because East Asia is really the only place which has sort of broken through what I call this glass ceiling. And the last point I'll make is that as I've said, both the World Bank and the IMF have recently, like in the last year, begun talking about industrial policy. But they're talking about industrial policy in a way that basically says to developing countries, don't do it. They claim to be saying, yes, there's opportunity for industrial policy, but the kind of conditions they put on it are like, you must identify a very clear market failure. Those conditions are such that in practice, they will tell developing country governments, presumably including Egypt, don't do industrial policy. So that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry to leave you on a pessimistic note.